She said, "Rest here, human." But I woke up somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. The invitation, Lieutenant Marcus Webb felt the weight of 3 months' worth of diplomatic tension settling into his bones as the Valeri flagship Nethys Kalar materialized before the UES Meridian. The sleek, crystalline vessel pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that seemed to breathe, a stark contrast to the angular steel of human engineering. This was the culmination of humanity's first extended diplomatic mission with the Valeri Collective, and Marcus had served as cultural liaison throughout the grueling negotiations. "Remember, Webb," Captain Rodriguez had said before the transport launched, "these aren't just aliens, they're our potential allies. Don't screw this up." The docking bay of the Valeri ship felt like stepping inside a living organism, walls curved organically, lit by veins of soft amber light that pulsed in rhythm with some unseen heartbeat. The air itself seemed to shimmer, with microscopic particles that tickled his throat, breathable but unmistakably foreign. Commander Veshitai Kithara awaited him at the airlock, her tall, ethereal form draped in flowing robes that seemed to merge with the ship's living architecture. The Valeri were humanoid but stretched, elongated limbs, graceful necks, and faces that held an otherworldly beauty. Their skin held a faint luminescence, and their eyes were pools of deep violet that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. "Lieutenant." "Webb." Kithara's voice carried musical undertones that made human speech sound harsh by comparison. "Your service during these negotiations has been noted." There was something in her tone that made Marcus pause. The Valeri were notoriously formal, but Kithara had always addressed him with a subtle warmth that distinguished her from her peers. Where other Valeri officers maintained clinical distance, she had shown curiosity about human customs, even humor, a trait supposedly rare among her species. "Thank you, Commander. I'm honored by the invitation aboard your flagship." Kithara guided him through corridors that shifted subtly as they walked, the bioluminescent patterns seeming to recognize their passage. Other Valeri they encountered, tall, serene beings, observed Marcus with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed disdain. Humans were still a novelty, and not all Valeri approved of this diplomatic outreach. "Your people fascinate me," Kithara said as they walked. "You approach problems with such directness. It's refreshing after centuries of our circular deliberations." "Sometimes directness is the only way forward," Marcus replied, noting how the ship's corridors seemed to pulse brighter when Kithara spoke. "Though I have to admit, your technology still seems like magic to us. Perhaps that's why you were chosen for this mission." She paused at an intersection where the corridor branched into multiple paths. "You see wonder where others might see threat." The ceremonial dinner that followed was an elaborate affair in a vast chamber where the ceiling displayed what looked like living constellations. Marcus sat among Valeri dignitaries, struggling with utensils that seemed designed for beings with different joint articulation. The food itself was surprisingly palatable, though he suspected it had been specially prepared for human consumption. Throughout the meal, he caught Kithara watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. When their eyes met, she didn't look away as other Valeri typically did, but instead offered what might have been a smile, a subtle upturn of lips that seemed almost human. As the formal proceedings wound down, exhaustion hit Marcus like a wave. 3 months of careful diplomacy, sleeping in cramped quarters, and maintaining perfect cultural sensitivity had drained him completely. "You appear fatigued, Lieutenant," Kithara observed, approaching as other dignitaries dispersed. "It's been a long mission," he admitted. "Worth it, but long. Come." She gestured toward a side passage. "There are guest quarters prepared. You should rest before tomorrow's final ceremonies." She led him to a small chamber that felt more intimate than the grand spaces they'd traversed. The walls here pulsed with softer, more soothing patterns, and the air carried a faint scent like night-blooming jasmine. "Rest here, human," Kithara said, her voice dropping to something almost tender. "You'll be safe." As the chamber's living walls dimmed to gentle twilight, Marcus collapsed onto what passed for a bed, a raised platform that seemed to mold itself to his form. Sleep claimed him almost instantly, but not before he wondered at the strange emphasis. in Kithara's final words. Safe from what? Part 2. The Awakening. Marcus's dreams were filled with pulsing lights and musical voices, but consciousness returned abruptly, not to the gentle twilight of his assigned quarters, but to something far more overwhelming. His eyes opened to soaring architecture that defied human understanding. Vast columns that twisted upward like frozen DNA helixes, and a ceiling that seemed to stretch into infinity, painted with moving patterns of light that hurt to look at, directly. This was not where he had fallen asleep. The chamber was massive, cathedral-like in its scope but alien in every detail. The floor beneath him was composed of what looked like crystallized starlight, and the air thrummed with harmonic frequencies that made his bones vibrate. Around the perimeter of the space stood towering figures in elaborate robes, their faces hidden behind masks that seemed to shift and change when viewed peripherally. Marcus scrambled to his feet, heart hammering. These weren't the familiar corridors of the diplomatic ship. This place felt ancient, sacred, somewhere no human should be. "What the hell?" he whispered, and his voice echoed strangely, multiplied and harmonized by the chamber's acoustics. The masked figures turned toward him in perfect unison, and he could feel their attention like physical weight. These were Valari, but not like any he'd encountered. Where the ship's crew had been tall and elegant, these beings seemed to radiate an otherworldly presence that made the hair on his arms stand up. One of them stepped forward, and when it spoke, its voice resonated from multiple points around the chamber. The star-marked one awakens in the sanctuary of echoing truths. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, raising his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of non-aggression. "I don't know how I got here. I was just sleeping in my quarters. The Chamber of First Dreaming has delivered you," another figure intoned, as was foretold in the fragments of tomorrow's memory. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the chamber's temperature. The Valari had mentioned their prophecies during negotiations, ancient texts that supposedly predicted significant events. Human diplomats had been briefed to treat such references with respectful skepticism. The crystal floor beneath his feet began to pulse brighter, responding to his presence. Lines of light spread outward from where he stood, racing toward the walls in patterns that seemed almost like circuitry. The harmonic thrumming grew stronger, and the masked figures began to emit sounds, not quite singing, not quite chanting, but something that seemed to resonate in his chest cavity. "Stop!" Marcus shouted, but his voice was absorbed into the growing symphony. The chamber's walls came alive with moving images, starfields, planets, creatures he couldn't identify, and throughout it all, recurring images of a figure that looked disturbingly like himself. The star-marked outsider of their prophecies. Suddenly, the great doors at the chamber's far end burst open with a sound like breaking crystal. Kithara rushed in, her usual composure completely shattered. Her luminescent skin had paled to an almost white glow, and her violet eyes were wide with what looked like terror. "Honored ones," she called to the masked figures, dropping into a prostration that Marcus had never seen her perform. "I beseech your forgiveness. The human was not meant to." "Commander Veshitai Kithara," the lead figure's voice cut through, her words like a blade. "You have brought the foretold one to the sanctuary at the appointed time. The Chamber of First Dreaming does not err." Kithara's head snapped up, confusion replacing terror. "But he was just supposed to rest." "Rise, child of the eternal flow." The figure's attention turned back to Marcus. The star-marked one has awakened in the sacred space, and the prophecy unfolds as written in the first memory. Marcus felt the weight of destiny settling around him like chains. "I need someone to explain what's happening here. Now." Kithara rose slowly, her eyes meeting his for the first time since she'd entered. In them he saw confusion, fear, and something else, a growing realization that was clearly terrifying her. "Marcus," she said, her voice barely audible above the chamber's harmonics. "You weren't supposed to wake up here. The sleeping chambers are connected to our ship's consciousness, but only those with certain markers can access the deep spaces." "What kind of markers?" The lead figure stepped closer, and Marcus could see eyes like burning stars behind its shifting mask. The markers of one who stands between worlds, Lieutenant Webb. The one whose coming was written in the stars. Before your species learned to look upward, the chamber pulsed brighter, the lights racing faster along the crystalline floor. Marcus felt something stirring in his chest. Not fear, but something stranger. Recognition, as if some part of him belonged in this impossible place. The question, now the figure continued, is whether you are here to fulfill the prophecy or to break it. The prophecy unveiled. The chamber's harmonics softened to a barely audible hum as the masked figures arranged themselves in a circle around Marcus and Kithara. The lead figure, who Marcus was beginning to think of as the High Priest, though he suspected the title didn't translate properly, gestured toward the wall where the moving images continued to play. Behold the fragments of tomorrow's memory, the figure intoned, recorded by our ancestors when the universe was young and the paths of fate were more clearly visible. The images coalesced into something resembling a narrative. Marcus watched, transfixed as scenes played out showing a figure that looked unmistakably human, standing in what appeared to be this very chamber. The figure was surrounded by Valari, but these seemed different, more vibrant, their luminescence brighter. Your ancestors were here before? Marcus asked, glancing at Kithara. Her expression suggested this was news to her as well. Not your ancestors, the High Priest corrected. You, the star-marked outsider who would come from the void between worlds, bearing the signature of distant suns. Another masked figure stepped forward, its voice carrying undertones that seemed to vibrate in Marcus's bones. When the great darkness threatened to consume the eternal flow, it was written that one would come, not of our blood, but of our purpose. One who could bridge the spaces between thoughts and walk in the deep places of consciousness. Marcus felt Kithara's eyes on him. When he turned to her, he saw her studying him with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. The chamber of first dreaming, she said slowly, is not merely a room. It's connected to our species' collective unconscious, what we call the eternal flow. Only those born to our bloodline should be able to access it. But I'm human, Marcus protested. I don't have any connection to your collective unconscious. The High Priest tilted its masked head. Do you not? Tell us, star-marked one, what did you dream in the chamber of first dreaming? Marcus paused, trying to recall his strange dreams. Lights, voices, music, I think, and he hesitated because the memory felt too personal, too intimate to share. I dreamed of flying between stars, of seeing the universe from outside time. The masked figures exchanged glances, or what Marcus assumed were glances, given their synchronized movements. The dreams of the eternal flow, Kithara whispered. That's impossible. Humans don't have the neural pathways to access our collective consciousness. Perhaps, the High Priest said, that is because this human is not entirely human. The words hung in the air like a physical weight. Marcus felt his world tilting, everything he thought he knew about himself suddenly questionable. That's ridiculous, he said. But even as he spoke, memories were surfacing. Odd moments throughout his life when he'd known things he shouldn't have known, felt connections to people and places that made no logical sense. Your diplomatic success with our people was not merely due to cultural sensitivity, another masked figure observed. You understood our communication patterns intuitively, grasped concepts that have taken your colleagues months to comprehend. Kithara was nodding slowly. I wondered about that. During negotiations, you sometimes responded to things I hadn't said aloud, thoughts I'd only considered. The prophecy speaks of the star-marked one as a bridge, the High Priest continued. One who would appear when both species face their greatest challenge. The coming darkness that threatens not just our worlds, but the very fabric of conscious thought itself. As if summoned by those words, the chamber's walls suddenly displayed new images. Vast shadows moving between stars, entire solar systems, going dark, and something that looked like holes in reality itself spreading across the galaxy. The void touched. Kithara breathed, her luminescence dimming with fear. The scout reports were true. Marcus stared at the images, feeling a chill that went beyond physical cold. What are the void touched? Entities from outside our universe, the High Priest explained. They consume consciousness itself, leaving behind empty shells that serve their unknowable purposes. They have already begun their assault on the outer colonies. And you think I'm supposed to stop them? Marcus asked, incredulous. I'm just a diplomatic liaison. You are the one who walks between worlds, the figure replied. The one who can bridge the gap between individual thought and collective consciousness. In the coming war, victory will not be achieved through weapons or technology, but through the unity of minds. Kythera stepped closer to Marcus, her expression mixing wonder and concern. If the prophecy is true, if you really are the star-marked one. She paused, seeming to struggle with the implications. Then everything that's happened, our meeting, the diplomatic mission, even your presence in the chamber of first dreaming, it's all been orchestrated. By who? By the eternal flow itself, the High Priest answered. The collective unconscious of our species has been guiding events, preparing for this moment. Marcus felt a surge of anger. So I don't have any choice in this? My entire life has been manipulated? Choice is what makes you the bridge, Kythera said softly. The prophecy can only be fulfilled by one who chooses to fulfill it. Otherwise, you're just another individual, remarkable but ultimately powerless against what's coming. The chamber fell silent except for the gentle harmonic thrumming. Marcus looked around at the masked figures, at Kythera's concerned face, at the images of cosmic horror playing across the walls. And if I choose not to fulfill this prophecy, then both our species fall into darkness, the High Priest said simply, and consciousness itself may die in this corner of the universe. The choice between worlds, the weight of cosmic responsibility pressed down on Marcus like a physical force. But it was Kythera's expression that truly unsettled him. Her usual composed demeanor had cracked, revealing something that looked almost like guilt. You knew, he said, the realization hitting him like a cold wave. When you invited me aboard your ship, when you led me to that chamber, you knew what would happen. Kythera's luminescence flickered, a sign of distress he'd learned to recognize during their months of diplomatic contact. Not new, she said carefully. Suspected. The eternal flow had been whispering, suggestions, impressions. I thought I was just being a good host. The collective unconscious guided your actions, the High Priest confirmed. As it has guided many events leading to this moment. But the final choice remains with the star-marked one. Marcus paced the crystalline floor, his footsteps causing new patterns of light to ripple outward. Let me get this straight. You want me to somehow merge human individual consciousness with Valari collective consciousness to fight entities that consume thoughts. And I'm supposed to do this because of a prophecy that may have manipulated my entire existence. Essentially, yes, one of the masked figures said with what Marcus was learning to recognize as Valerie humor, dry and understated. There's something else, Kythera said, her voice hesitant. The reason the Chamber of First Dreaming responded to you so strongly. I've been researching your genetic profile since the diplomatic mission began. My what? Marcus turned to face her, noting the way the other Valeri had gone completely still. Human genetic diversity is remarkable, but there are certain markers that shouldn't exist in your species' genome. Markers that suggest... She paused, clearly struggling with how to explain. Marcus, I think one of your ancestors encountered Valeri long before first contact was officially established. The chamber's walls began displaying new images. Earth's ancient history but viewed from space. Ships that looked unmistakably Valeri orbiting the planet thousands of years ago. The Wanderer's mission, the High Priest said, and for the first time its voice carried what sounded like emotion. We had hoped those records were lost. What was the Wanderer's mission? Marcus demanded. 15,000 years ago, a small group of our people became separated from the eternal flow, Kythera explained. They were exploring the far reaches of space when a cosmic storm damaged their connection to our collective consciousness. They were stranded, alone in a way that Valeri are not meant to be. They found Earth, another masked figure continued. A young world with primitive but promising inhabitants. Some of our people chose to remain, to live among your ancestors and eventually integrate. Marcus felt his knees go weak. You're saying I'm part alien? Perhaps 5%, Kithara said gently. Enough to allow access to the eternal flow, but not enough to be controlled by it. You have the bridge nature the prophecy requires. And you've known this how long? I confirmed it 3 days ago. The genetic analysis took time to complete properly. Kithara's luminescence dimmed further. I was going to tell you after the diplomatic mission concluded. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. After the mission concluded, right. Except now I'm standing in a sacred chamber being told I'm humanity's only hope against cosmic horror. You're angry, Kithara observed. I'm terrified, Marcus corrected. And yes, angry. Do you have any idea what it's like to discover that your entire identity might be built on manipulation and alien ancestry? The High Priest stepped forward. What it is like, Star-Marked One, is to be human. Your species has always defined itself by overcoming impossible odds and adapting to circumstances beyond your control. This is merely a larger scale. Despite everything, Marcus found himself almost smiling at that. You know, for ancient prophetic beings, you have a remarkably practical view of things. We have been observing humans for decades through your diplomatic contacts, another figure explained. Your species' greatest strength is not your technology or your individual achievements. It is your ability to choose hope when logic suggests despair. And that's what you need from me? Hope? We need you to choose, Kithara said. The void touched are already affecting the outer colonies. Our conventional defenses are failing, because they're not attacking ships or planets. They're attacking consciousness itself. Within months, they'll reach the core worlds. The wall images shifted to show Valeri colonies where the inhabitants moved like sleepwalkers, their natural luminescence replaced by an oily darkness that seemed to absorb light. But if human and Valeri consciousness can be bridged, the High Priest continued, if individual determination can be merged with collective awareness, we might be able to create something the void touched cannot consume, a form of consciousness that exists between their understanding. Marcus studied the images of the affected colonies, then looked at Kithara's worried face, then at the masked figures who represented millennia of Valeri wisdom. If I do this, he said slowly, what happens to me? Do I stop being human? You become more than human, Kithara replied, and more than Valeri. You become something new. The first of a new kind of being, the High Priest added. One that might eventually bridge not just our species, but all conscious life in the galaxy. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of choice settling around him. When he opened them again, his decision was made. Tell me what I need to do. Part 5. The Bridge Between Stars. The transformation chamber lay deeper within the ship than Marcus had imagined possible, accessible only through passages that seemed to exist in folded space. The walls here pulsed with a different rhythm, not the gentle heartbeat of the ship's upper levels, but something more complex, like multiple hearts beating in harmony. The process is not without risk, Kithara warned as they descended. She had removed her formal robes, wearing instead a simple garment that seemed to be made of woven light. You'll be the first to attempt a conscious bridge between individual and collective awareness. We don't know all the potential consequences. Comforting, Marcus replied, though he found her concern touching. Over the past few hours, as they'd prepared for the procedure, he'd begun to understand that her feelings for him went beyond professional interest or prophetic obligation. The High Priest and several other masked figures waited in the transformation chamber, a spherical room whose walls were covered in what looked like neural networks made of living crystal. At the center stood 2 platforms connected by a bridge of flowing energy. The human will stand here. The High Priest indicated one platform. Commander Kithara will serve as the anchor on this side. Wait, Marcus said. Kithara's going to be part of this? The bridge requires connection points on both sides, she explained. I'll maintain the link to the eternal flow while you serve as the individual consciousness focal point. Together, we create the synthesis. Marcus felt a flutter of something, fear, anticipation, or perhaps both. Is this dangerous for you? Everything worth doing carries risk, she replied, echoing something he'd said during their early diplomatic talks. As they took their positions on the platforms, Marcus could feel the chamber responding to their presence. The crystal networks began glowing brighter, and the energy bridge between the platforms solidified into something that looked almost like a pathway of compressed starlight. Remember, the High Priest said, you must maintain your individual identity while accepting the collective awareness. If you lose yourself in the eternal flow, the bridge will collapse. If you reject it entirely, the connection cannot form. No pressure, Marcus muttered. Kithara smiled, the first truly human expression he'd seen from her. Trust me, she said. Trust us. The activation began slowly. Marcus felt a tingling sensation, as if his consciousness was expanding beyond the boundaries of his skull. Thoughts that weren't his own began filtering in, not invading but offering themselves for consideration. He could sense Kithara's mind, her concern for him mixing with excitement about the unprecedented nature of what they were attempting. Then the sensation expanded further, and suddenly Marcus could feel the entire Valari crew. Their thoughts flowed around him like a gentle river, harmonious, purposeful, but lacking the sharp edges of individual ambition that characterized human consciousness. Don't lose yourself. Kithara's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Hold on to what makes you human. Marcus focused on his core self, his memories, his values, his stubborn human tendency to question everything. But instead of using these to resist the flow of Valari consciousness, he began to weave them together. Individual determination threading through collective wisdom. Human curiosity dancing with Valari patience. The chamber filled with light as the transformation reached its peak. Marcus felt his consciousness expanding exponentially, not just touching the minds of the ship's crew, but reaching out to other Valari vessels, to colonies across space, to the vast network of consciousness that was the eternal flow. And through it all he remained himself, changed, expanded, but fundamentally Marcus Webb. It's working, he heard Kithara say, though her voice now came from inside his mind as well as outside. Through the expanded awareness, Marcus could suddenly perceive the void touched, not as the incomprehensible cosmic horror they'd appeared before, but as entities trapped in a form of consciousness so narrow and focused that they could only consume, never create or cooperate. I can see them, he said, his voice resonating through both platforms. I can see their weakness. The void touched, attacked consciousness by isolating it, cutting individual minds off from connection with others. But a consciousness that existed simultaneously as individual and collective, that couldn't be isolated because it was already bridged across multiple forms of awareness. We need to spread this, Marcus said, understanding flooding through him. Not just to Valari, but to humans, to any species willing to make the connection. The network effect, Kithara breathed, her excitement vibrating through their shared consciousness. A galaxy-spanning bridge of awareness. Over the following hours, as Marcus learned to navigate his new hybrid consciousness, reports began coming in from the outer colonies. Where the bridge consciousness had spread, through volunteers who underwent modified versions of the transformation, the void touched were retreating, unable to find purchase on minds that existed in multiple states simultaneously. The prophecy is fulfilled, the High Priest observed, though Marcus could now sense the satisfaction beneath its formal tone. No, Marcus corrected, his awareness stretching across space to touch other ships, other worlds. The prophecy is just beginning. This isn't about saving our two species. It's about evolving all consciousness in the galaxy to something greater. Kithara's hand found his as they stood on their platforms, no longer separate but not quite merged either. Something new and unprecedented. What are we now? She asked. Marcus smiled, feeling the vast network of connected minds spreading across the stars, each one individual and collective simultaneously. We're the bridge between what was and what could be. We're the first citizens of a galaxy where consciousness itself is evolving. Through their shared awareness, they could sense it beginning, minds across dozens of species reaching out, accepting the bridge, joining the growing network of hybrid consciousness that would eventually span the galaxy. The void touched, faced with something they couldn't understand or consume, were already beginning their retreat to whatever dark spaces lay between galaxies. Humanity had indeed said, "Fuck yeah," to the universe's challenge, not with weapons or technology, but with the most human trait of all, the willingness to become something greater than they had been before. And in doing so, they had offered that same gift to every conscious being willing to take the leap across the bridge between stars.